I want to thank everyone for coming tonight, taking time out of their busy schedules to join us here to talk about a subject that's near and dear to my heart. Before we get started, I do want to just put in another plug, not for the New Hampshire Humanities Council. They're the ones that help sponsor this event, and they have events statewide. I go to all corners of the state throughout the course of the year, giving this and several other lectures. And the nice thing about them is they are free and open to the public, and they cost the host, in this case the Library and the Historical Society, very little. So it's a win-win for everyone. So check out their website, nhhc.org, and look for other programs. We have somewhat like 100 speakers in the humanities to go bureau, and there's some very, very good speakers that are out there on a wide range of humanities, historic, Chautauqua type topics. So please give them your support. And I also want to thank Jim and the folks here at the library for inviting me back. I've been to Hooksett now, I think, 3 years in a row in one form or another. And so it's a nice, easy drive from Wolfboro too. And more importantly tonight, talking about beer, you guys really got it all here. You got your own nano brewery, so to speak, with white birch. Anybody tried any of their stuff?
No.
Please, somebody raise their hand, okay? Had a few of you there. So that's great. You know, in Wolfboro, we don't have anything real close by, although we're getting our own brewery pretty soon, so I have to drive a ways. And then I'm not putting in any commercial plugs necessarily, but Bert's Better Beers, you want to try beers from around the state or around the world, there's a great place to go. So you guys have pretty easy access to some great beers. Now, as you can probably tell from my biography, I typically talk about or write about more serious subjects, but I am a beer lover. So a friend of mine who is a home brewer, I am not, so I'm totally illiterate in that way. We got to talking one night about the history of beer in New Hampshire and how it was brewed and when it got its beginnings. And so the result of that is the book Brewing in New Hampshire. So if you're interested in that, see me afterwards. This is the only commercial plug you get, and or it's available at most local bookstores. You can check it out. But it gives a really good pictorial and text account of the earliest beginnings through the early 2000s. But it's a fast-changing environment. The brewing industry is in New Hampshire as well as nationwide, and so at the end we'll kind of talk about that. So the most important thing to remember is brewing in New Hampshire started at the very beginning, okay? Our English colonists were beer drinkers, okay? That was a major part of their diet, if you will, okay? It's not like today where it was age restricted. Back then, people young and old drank beer, primarily because water, as we know it today, was unfit to drink largely. So these fermented beverages, and the English were known for their fine ales, was one of their national drinks. And it came in varying strengths. Today we measure the strength by talking about alcoholic content. A low beer, 3.2, 3.5, 4.1% alcohol, versus the stronger beers, anywhere 9, 10, and much greater percentage. Back then they didn't have a way of scientifically measuring that, but they did know just by the length of fermenting the beer, and of course by taste and consumption and experience, what type. So young children typically drank a beer that was what we might call near beer or short beer today, fermented for perhaps only a couple weeks. And of course, on the other end, you had something called ship's beer that sailors really liked, and was provided by sailing captains to their crews. And that was probably the equivalent of something at 10 or 11% alcohol. So a lot stronger, because that's what sailors like. So beer was here from the beginning. I want to read to you a little excerpt from Belknap's History of New Hampshire, written in the 1831 edition, but written in the late 1700s. And this is a letter that was written by the factor, or the manager of the first New Hampshire colony. And he's writing back to England, and he has this to say. This is in July 13th, 1633. So just a little over a decade after New Hampshire was established. And he says, I haven't had beer this 4 months, for I have for 2 and 20 months before had but 2 barrels of beer and 2 barrels and 4 bushels of malt. Our number commonly hath been 10. I, nor the servants, have neither money nor clothes. I have been as sparing as I could, but it will not do. Now, what's the thing that jumps out at you the most about this letter that's being written? He doesn't have beer, and then he mentions money, and then he mentions clothes. So beer was a pretty important commodity back then. So that's important to remember. When our colonists first hit our shores, they did not always have the ingredients that they needed to brew beer. So they had to make do with what they could find. So the adjuncts or the additives that give beer its flavor and taste and various nuances, they had to improvise. So if any of you have had say a pumpkin ale in the fall today, and you think it's, oh, that's something new and exciting. It's a great beer, but it's something that's been done before. That's what our early colonists drank. Spruce tip beer, which is a little quite uncommon today, but there are especially some home brewers out there that are making it. Spruce tips were very common in New England, anywhere there's a forest basically, so that's one of the other ingredients our colonists were using. And then of course, any other ingredients they could find local, so whether it's blueberries, cherries, fruits, anything they could add to flavor their beer. So a lot of the history of brewing in New Hampshire, and indeed in New England, is a case of what comes around goes around. So what we see today is new and exciting, these varietals of beer, were actually kind of what our colonists were doing out of necessity way back in the early days. And I don't know if any of you like Sam Adams beer. It's certainly not a New Hampshire beer, but I love to talk about it a little bit, only because it's that association with the American Revolution. And I always say that alcohol, in part, helped fuel the American Revolution. If we think about the patriots who dumped the tea into Boston's harbor, the Boston Tea Party, where were they at before they did that? Well, they were gathering at the local tavern and drinking numerous pints of ale before they went about their business. In New Hampshire, we had similar incidents in Portsmouth prior to Fort William and Mary being captured by our local Sons of Liberty, if you will. And we had local brewers that were working in the seacoast, especially very heavy. Almost every town had brewers of some sort, whether they were based in the tavern or based in the families brewing for their own needs. One of the fellows that was brewing in Stratham, New Hampshire on the seacoast was a man named William Pottle. And he would provide all the Portsmouth taverns with their beverages. And unfortunately, he was a Tory. He did not support the American Revolution. He liked the King of England and wanted to stick with the king. And so one day when he's making his rounds, delivering his beer in Portsmouth, he's spotted by a townsman, Deacon Thomas Boardman. And Boardman sees this Tory delivering his wares, and he gathers a crowd around, and he thunders out in this ad hoc speech he gives how he would not drink beer brewed by a Tory. And he whipped the crowd into such a frenzy that Pottle had to literally flee from Portsmouth for his life and hide out in Stratham for a few days, where a number of Tories lived in that town. And never again did he supply beer to the taverns of Portsmouth. After that point, it was all provided by those who were friendly with the American Revolution and its spirit. So we had those types of connections, if you will. And with that, let's get into the slides if we can hit some of the lights here. As we say, the changes when it comes to brewing in New Hampshire have really been quite vivid over the years. The way we view alcohol today and its consumption is not the same as it was in colonial times, and really right up until the 1950s and 60s. Now here I have what I kind of like to call the patron saint of brewing in New Hampshire, Reverend Samuel Hagan of Portsmouth. Now one of the jobs of the local pastor or priest, if you will, especially in colonial days in the 1780s and before, was to visit his parishioners at least once a year, maybe twice a year, and to check on their needs, spiritual and otherwise, make sure they're doing okay. Well, that's what he did in Portsmouth. Portsmouth is a seafaring town, a little bit gritty. The sailors are a rough and tumble lot. They like to drink a lot. They like beer, but more they like what we would call the demon drinks, rum, whiskey, things like that. And so as he's making his rounds among perhaps some of the lesser in society, he notices the problem of drunkenness and domestic abuse and things like that. So he makes an unusual proposition to the Piscataway Association of Ministers in 1787. He proposes that they establish and build a brewery that would be operated by this association of ministers, and therefore they could get this beer, this more common and less harmful beverage, out to the public, and might ameliorate some of the effects of the hard alcohol that was out there. This brewery, sponsored by this minister, was seriously considered. It was ultimately rejected. But it's the only case in New England, and perhaps in the entire country, at this early age where a brewery was attempted to be formed by the ministry. So we don't see quite those associations today, do we? So things really were quite different back then, and the way beer was viewed was a lot different. And here we see the General Wolfe Tavern over in Rochester, New Hampshire. These tavern signs are indicative of where the primary brewing was happening in the colonial days, and really right up until the 1840s or so. Beer was primarily brewed at home by the family. This was primarily the woman's job, she being the household manager, the children helping in these efforts certainly, while the man is off either plowing his fields, primarily a rural economy in New Hampshire, and tending to the outbuildings, things like that. And the same thing was true for tavern owners. They primarily brewed their own beverages in quantities large and small, and this was where the early industry started. So when you think of the brew pubs that we have today, again, it's a matter of what comes around goes around. The idea of producing your own beer and being fresh right there on the premises is a great idea, and it's the same thing that our colonials were doing. And again, we talk about this very social event too. These tavern places were not just places to go and have a drink and have a meal, but they were also local gathering places for momentous events of local and national import. They also served as militia and army recruiting places during the American Revolution and subsequent wars. So we might imagine that many a pint of ale was consumed before these young men signed up to give their military service. So these types of places were really where all the beer was being produced at the time. And here's a typical advertisement of the day. Again, this is for the Portsmouth's Bell Tavern. And I don't know if you can read it, but the subscriber informs his friends and the public that he has taken that central and commodious house lately occupied by Mr. Greenleaf as the Bell Tavern, and has opened a public house for the reception and accommodation of ladies and gentlemen, travelers and others. He flatters himself he shall be able to maintain his guests in an agreeable manner. His table will be supplied with the best the season and market affords, and these last two provisions are key. His liquors of every kind are pure and genuine, and his stable shall be well attended and furnished with the best hay. This, of course, being for travelers. Now, we like to think of the Granite State as kind of the live free or die state, don't we? Well, the fact of the matter is, starting from about the 1720s and well through the colonial period and into the modern age, we had laws regarding beer and its consumption. But primarily, the two earliest laws that we have is the 1720s law stated that all taverns or public houses, as they were called back then, had to serve either hard cider or beer. Okay, so imagine a restaurant opening today and we say, wait, you can't open that, or we can't license you unless you serve those things. And the other thing that they had to provide was feed or provender for the horses, for travelers as they made their way through various areas. So there were laws regarding these. There were also many local laws, and many towns had what we might call today the equivalents of weights and measures people, whose job it was to go to these various taverns and make sure that the liquors were indeed pure and genuine. Okay? Can anyone imagine that maybe a tavern keeper or an unscrupulous one might water down his beer so his product would go further? He might get a bad reputation in town, but some towns may not have had many options. So There were local officials that oftentimes went to the various taverns in town to taste the product, and what a great job to have, and make sure that it was indeed pure and genuine. The laws never specified what they meant by pure and genuine, but it was a simpler time, and everyone knew a good beer when they tasted one. Okay, and so there were many regulations regarding that. Some towns, by the way, in New Hampshire were dry and did not allow the serving of any kind of alcohol. Francistown, New Hampshire was one of those towns, and a number of towns throughout the state were dry at varying periods. As far as I know, I don't think we have any today, but it was determined by each locality, which was good tavern business for the next town over if you happen to live in a dry town. And so, you know, again, regulations were out there for that. I like to show this, we perhaps tend to think of the fancy pewter mugs or drinking vessels that they used back then. Well, the fact of the matter is most people were drinking out of these much more simple woodenware vessels, crafted by hand, in this case held together by a rawhide string. Notice the hinged top on it kind of reminds us of those fancy German steins that we see today. Well, the fact of the matter is most taverns were rather rustic in nature, perhaps with dirt floors or very roughly hewn walls, mud-daubed walls perhaps, especially in colonial times. So, and of course, if you think about a night like tonight, a hot summer night, perhaps you know, some black flies or mosquitoes making their appearances. So you really needed that cover on there to protect your beer more than anything. And of course, they drank beer at room temperature. So a lot different purpose than what we might think of today. And by the way, every town in New Hampshire, except those that were dry for varying periods, had taverns. I'm not sure how many Hooksett had. Can you speak to that, or no?
My understanding, we had at least 10 at one point.
Yeah.
Prescott Tavern, Jones Tavern, where Andrew Jackson stopped.
Oh.
Tavern across from Old Town Hall.
So a number of taverns, yeah, 10.
Also had the estate was a tavern from the beginning.
Yeah. And this was very, very typical. Even in a small town like Bristol, New Hampshire, that had only a couple thousand people, had 10 taverns. Portsmouth had well over 15, close to 20. The interesting thing about these taverns is that it was a one respectable position that, or job, if you will, that women could have. Women were, you know, restricted in many of their rights. They couldn't vote and all sorts of things like that. But they could serve as tavern keepers, own their own taverns, which was quite common throughout the state. So again, women were quite vital in the early brewing industry, and that has held true to this day. Women are very active in the craft beer movement today, both in New Hampshire and nationwide. So it's not surprising that many craft beer makers today are really gearing their market towards women as well as men. So that's something, again, that harkens back to the older days. Yes, sir.
Did the taverns at that time have a bar as such that people stood at, or did they just have tables?
Primarily tables in the early colonial day, and then that idea as far as standing or sitting at the bar kind of developed, and I'm not sure when the change occurred, but you know, the taverns really were places of sociability, and there were some taverns that were respectable where you could bring your wife or family and drink and have, you know, make merry, if you will. And there were other rough and tumble taverns in towns where it's where the men folk went, or perhaps some of the lesser folks in society went and drank to excess. So there were many differing. Portsmouth is an excellent example. They had some of these upper crust taverns, like a Bell Tavern, where, you know, the elite in society would go, including the town's ministers, whether congregational or Episcopalian, and then you had some of the lesser-known taverns. I think widow Rachel Webster ran a tavern that was cited numerous times for raucous and bawdy behavior emanating from that, and of course very noisy. So, you know, they're very, just like today, there's respectable drinking establishments and there's not so respectable. By the way, looking at that mug, How many of you ever been to a place where you can, you can buy a mug and you can keep it stored at the bar there? It's like you got your own number on it or whatever. I know up in my locale in Wolfboro, the Wolfboro Inn, you can buy a mug, you keep it hanging on the ceiling there. That idea of kind of having your own personal service began in colonial times as well, when wealthier patrons often brought in their own serviceware, so they didn't have to share that with the commoners or whatever. Here's another, I just happen to like this sign, entertainment by Peter Sleeper, or P. Sleeper. It seems like if you're a sleeper, you're probably destined to go into the tavern business back then. As we get out of past the American Revolution, that's when we start to see a slow change in the brewing industry in New Hampshire and New England. It's still quite prevalent in the tavern-based and certainly still continuing at home. And by the way, as far as home brewing in New Hampshire, really up until Prohibition, that was something that was quite common. And of course, even after Prohibition, but we don't have as much details about that. Certainly Prohibition didn't kill home brewing, but beer was very commonly brewed at home and in the taverns. And beer's major competitor, by the way, was hard cider. And especially in the rural areas where apple trees and the making of hard cider was not a complicated affair, hard cider oftentimes outstripped beer in its consumption. In the urban areas, we see that beer oftentimes, again, had the upper hands there. So, but those two beverages, and again, remember tavern law said that either one of those beverages had to be served. However, by the late 1800s, by the late 1700s, 1810s, we start to see a subtle shift in the brewing industry to the shop front, if you will. So imagine a store in town that sells kegs of nails and sperm oil for lighting and illumination and all sorts of the general store, if you will. Well, you also have these guys that are either brewing their own beer and selling it out of their shop front, or they have associates who are brewing beer and providing it for them. So here we see an example of that from 1836. We have a champagne or small beer. I love this advertisement. This is not a newspaper advertisement. This is a handbill. It's posted on the streets of our state capital in the late 1830s. It says, champagne or small beer. And it's kind of filled with a couple lies here, which I really like. Champagne or small beer, this valuable article has long been sought for and lately discovered, which is a lie. We've known that for 200 years before. It being the richest and most nourishing drink ever offered, also a lie. There's much more heartier beers that have been fermented much longer. And this is prepared by Charles C. Hodgson opposite the American Hotel. And he says, although many have sought to find out the invention of this beer, they have never been able to discover its genuine origin, nor cannot, unless, of course, certificates be given by its author, who happens to be Charles C. Hodgson, the guy given this advertisement. But he says, I shall keep at all times through the summer season the same kind of beer at my shop, opposite the American House, or my favorite part, or otherwise in a cart which will pass frequently through the streets. The subscribers are acquainted with the composition and the manner of making this champagne beer, and consider it the most inoffensive of any beer in common use. Now that's true, very lightly fermented. I think of Miller High Life, the old-time advertisement used to call it the champagne of beers, very low alcoholic content. And he goes on to say it contains no active or deleterious ingredient, and those who use it will find it a valuable substitute for cider, porter, mead, strong beer at all seasons of the year. And it's endorsed by 3 doctors, so it's a really healthy product. I would submit to you that if you like your hard cider and porter and mead and strong beer, you're probably not going to really take to champagne or small beer. But this does point out one other thing, that the temperance movement, the effort to ban alcohol, the sale and consumption of alcohol in New Hampshire and, again, nationwide, this is a movement that got started in the 1820s in New Hampshire and gained steam as we approached the Civil War era, often tied in with the abolition movement. So there were attempts to kind of combat that and find substitutes for something that was not something that's considered less offensive, if you will. Again, at this point, there's no age restrictions on drinking beer or any other alcoholic beverage. Okay, it was all common sense. And we read in old diaries of the time, there are, people that make comments about so-and-so being a town drunk. So these issues were known and commented about, but it was largely something that was much more dealt with on a local level. There were no state laws or even national laws dealing with it. Beer brewing in the brewery tradition that we think of today really got started in America in the late 1830s, 1840s. And of course, the earliest breweries are established in places like Philadelphia, New York, the larger cities, where the larger populations were. New Hampshire and some of the smaller states come along about a decade later. The first known or established brewery that we know of anyway in New Hampshire was by a German immigrant, Reverius Burt, in Manchester. We often think of Portsmouth as the kind of the epicenter of the brewing industry in New Hampshire, and it was, but really Manchester, which also was gaining a large population because of the mill complexes there, had the first brewery. Now, Burt's brewery only lasted a couple years. A German immigrant, he probably moved westward to kind of some of the beer meccas like Cincinnati, St. Louis, Chicago, and places like that in the Midwest. But so Reverius Burt gets the credit. But really, Portsmouth and the seacoast also were predominant in the brewing industry. And I spoke earlier of female involvement in the brewing industry is very important. And here we see, again, the only known example in the pre-modern era where actually a woman operated her own brewery. And this is Mrs. Henry Evans. We'll call her Martha. That's her real name. Her husband originally was the brewer, and we would imagine that she learned the trade and he helped her out. We don't know anything about their brewery other than it lasted in Dover for 3 or 4 years before Henry Evans passed away. And then Mrs. Henry Evans, or Martha, and her who had 2 children at the time, took over operations of the brewery. And of course, as you can see, brewed a stock, pale, and amber ale at the Cochico Brewery in Dover. If any of you know Dover and have been to Dover and know where Red Shoe Barn is, many people know where that's at. That's where it was, off Broadway Avenue, coincidentally near the railroad line there. So it's by late 1850s, early 1860s that the brewing industry really gets rolling. And here we see an example on the seacoast, again, Portsmouth, the M. Fisher and Sons Brewing Company that would later continue in the same family but become the Eldridge Brewery. It was always about the second largest brewery in New Hampshire, and it had a long history from the late 1850s until Prohibition, 1917. And here we see it's kind of at its early stages. We see the central brew house here. And we notice all that in this old lithograph, all the activity going on. You've got the railroad, which was crucial to the widening of the brewing industry in New Hampshire. Now, brews could be marketed on a much wider basis, okay? The idea of selling kegs of beer goes back to the very beginning. The cooper, the man that makes and maintains and fixes the kegs, was a primary player in the brewing industry. Every good brewer had a good cooper. And we can see the kegs here that are waiting to be filled or perhaps repaired. The idea, if you've ever rented a keg and you've got to return your keg or you don't get your deposit back, here we see the brewery wagon heading away from the railroad, taking back some empties there. So some key parts of the brewing distribution that we think of today were very common back then. Of course, you had to have water to brew beer, so all of these places were located near bodies of water, so it's natural that Portsmouth with Islington Stream, Dover with the Cochico River, Manchester and Nashua with the Merrimack would be centers of brewing. Also in the West, Walpole on the Connecticut River had a ill-fated brewery. It didn't last very long, but it was a very modern brewery. Here we see this brewery about 20 years later, roughly around 1890 or so. Notice how it's expanded. You can see the little bridge here over Islington Creek. And again, it's now, at this point, it's Eldridge Brewery. And again, always the second largest in New Hampshire. Frank Jones, any of you ever heard of the Frank Jones Brewing Company? They were the leaders in New Hampshire, but the Eldridge Brewery did a respectable business for many years, and you can see by the size of its establishment in this later lithograph that it was quite flourishing. And here we see the final years of the brewery. This is roughly 1915 or so. Notice how it's expanded. It's built a Germanic clock tower here along next to the large smokestack. Remnants of this building still exist in Portsmouth on Broad Avenue today. I think it's part of that building there. The rest has been torn down. What's left is now an office complex, but this again shows its interesting brewery architecture. Most breweries were built off of German models, you know, the typical German brewery or brew house, if you will, always had a central building where the brewing was being done, and then you had the outlying buildings where you know, either power was generated and storage of the beer for it to be conditioned, and the cooper shop and places like that. What is interesting, I like about this, you can't see it very well in this old grainy photograph, but you see an alcove in the side of the brewery, and that's actually a statue in that alcove. And that's, anybody of you ever heard of King Gambrinus? Well, he's kind of the patron saint of brewing from Germany. Big over in Germany. Almost every brewery in Germany had this statue of this kingly figure. He had dressed in robes and a crown. He's always got his arm outstretched with a tankard of ale, if you will. So this is the only known New Hampshire brewery that kind of followed this model. And of course, the rumors have abounded ever since this brewery closed in 1917. Whatever happened to the statue? And every once in a while, someone thinks they found it, but no one's found it really yet. And here we see the inside of the Frank Jones Brewing Company. Now, Frank Jones is an interesting fellow. He's from Barrington, New Hampshire. He starts with nothing. He runs away from home at an early age, 14 or 15. He goes to Portsmouth, New Hampshire, where he makes a living first selling stoves, cast iron stoves. Everyone needed a stove back then. And if you could make a living in that cutthroat business, you could go on to better things. Well, what he did is he partnered up with an Englishman in Portsmouth named John Swindell. Now, Swindell's ale in Portsmouth, or all of New Hampshire for that matter, was considered about the best beer that there was. Swindell was an Englishman and had a great recipe. The problem was, this might be a problem with some in the brewing industry, is he drank a little bit too much of his own beer. And so he was considered somewhat of a drunkard. Frank Jones stayed in business with him for about a year and then bought him out lock, stock, and barrel. And kept Swindell's recipe as his own, which was probably part of the agreement. We don't really know the details. But Frank Jones then went on to create a brewing empire in New Hampshire. Now, Frank Jones was known for many things. He was the J.P. Morgan, or the DuPont of the day, what some may call the robber baron, the rich tycoon of his day in New Hampshire. He came within a hair's breadth of controlling the telephone industry. He lost a court case, but he was very heavily involved with that. He was the chairman of the Boston and Maine Railroad. He had owned the Granite State Fire Insurance Company, but his wealth primarily came from his brewery. And even though he didn't start out as a brewer, that was always his love the rest of his life until he died in 1902. He built up that brewery from 1858, and in the early 1890s, he sold it to an English company for $6 million. Now, $6 million in the 1890s today, it translates to about $150 million. So he built up a huge business. And this shows the inside of his Portsmouth brewery. Here we see the brewmaster standing next to the brew kettle. Look how clean it is in there. Have any of you ever been to the Bud plant, or perhaps Red Hook would be more appropriate in size and comparison? There's not that much difference in what you would see here. And I would contend that a brewer today, going back in time to a factory or a brewery like this, would do okay. And in the same regard, a brewmaster back then, going forward in time, might have to learn a little science and a little computer technology, but other than that, he would do okay, because the brewing industry has not changed all that much. Brewing beer is brewing beer. The equipment changes and the controls change. We go from some manual jobs to some computerized things, but ultimately, it's the same thing. Here we see the ultra-modern filling station. Now, if you've been in any modern brewery, of course, you see the automated filling lines, the hundreds of bottles going through very fast. Well, this was fast back then, and when this was taken, about 1902. So you got one guy, and they actually had 3 of these filling stations, so he's sitting there filling 6 bottles at a time. And notice their India Pale Ale. Almost all craft breweries today, I mean, an India Pale Ale or an Indian Ale of some sort is often the flagship brew. It was the most popular beer in New England at the time. And New Englanders, by the way, in New Hampshire included, stuck to their ales. Other parts of the country, like New York and New Jersey and the mid-Atlantic states, were often switching to lagers. Now, I'm a lager guy, I love lagers, but brewing lager, a true lager, which had to be, aged in cold fashion for quite a bit longer time. And the yeast was much more difficult to transport across the ocean from Germany to America. So lager beers really weren't introduced in America until the 1840s. But New Englanders stuck to their ales and really loved their work. So here you see the worker giving him his empty bottles. Notice the one dangling light bulb up there. So again, the height of industrialization in the brewing process. And then we've got the capping process. Now, again, back in the day, it wasn't the pop-top cans or even screw-off cans. It was all a cork and wire assembly. If you had some of the more expensive craft beers of today, many of them have gone back to that. But here you've got a fellow sitting at a machine which has a hopper up here for the corks that fall down below, and then he's attaching a wire assembly. And again, there's a room with 3 or 4 of these guys doing this. Notice all the crates of beer in the background here. Notice the belt-driven machinery. If you were to look on the other side, not far away in this factory, there are huge banks of coal-fired ovens that are providing the steam to run these devices. So again, this was the height of modernness, if you will. And then, of course, brewing, I've talked to many brewers in the course of writing my book and giving this lecture, and one thing I tell you about brewers, whether they're home brewers or professional brewers, they are a quirky bunch. They are intelligent, they're scientific, but they